Good afternoon and good day, everybody. Welcome back to Hobbit Immersion Camp. Today is class number 9 as we look at the big battle at the Clouds Burst, our one single chapter class here today, or this during this camp. And so let's see, Ms. Binkley, let's see, I'm not getting your picture here. Did you remember to?
I'm not getting a picture either.
Oh, dear.
All I'm getting is a clink clink as I try to select this, so it may be something that I'm going to have to restart.
Okay, yeah, you can go ahead and go out, come back in again, perhaps.
I will be back.
Okay, no problem. And in the meantime, if you guys have any other questions that you would like me to ask, I would be happy to. I would be happy to do that. Here, let me. There we go. Okay, and we will let Ms. Binkley go out and come back in here and make sure that her connection is working fine there. So, any questions that you guys have? Anything that you would like to ask me about today? You know, we've been really enjoying your questions and everything along the way. And all the things that you're interested in. I wonder if there are any other things that you have been interested in that you guys would like to talk about. And, you know, thinking back to, I mean, there's certainly a couple other things that I could think about, since, you know, that I could talk about from yesterday's class too. But let's see, Jubilee asks, how long has it been since Bilbo started the journey? Well, the journey starts, we know exactly when the journey starts. The journey starts on April 30th. And it's fall now. In fact, we can say pretty clearly, because he leaves his house, he leaves Bag End on April 30th, and he arrives in Lake Town. So he is in Lake Town, feasting in Lake Town and saying, "Thank you very much," with his stuffy nose, when on his birthday, which is September 22nd. So that's what, 5 months? Right, from April 30th, a little bit less than 5 months. So by the time they're up at the mountain and everything, it's been about 5 months. So it's a long journey, but it's not you know, it's not like he's been traveling for years. They've been traveling for months. And it's actually an interesting thing. When Tolkien was originally writing The Hobbit, his first idea was that the journey was going to be much longer. He was originally, Bilbo's journey, when in Tolkien's first ideas, was his journey was going to take like 1.5 years. But in the end, when he, by the time he published it, when he had finished revising it, he had decided that it only took about 5 months to get there. CJ asks, are orcs and goblins the same thing? Yes, basically yes. The word orc is used to describe. You know, there's two times when it's used in The Hobbit. The one main time when it's used outside of a list is when it's used to describe big goblins. Right? Remember when Bilbo is going towards the back door. And he thinks, like, well, there can't be very big goblins down this tunnel, right? Because it's relatively small. So he said, so the narrator says that, you know, he didn't know that even large goblins, even the great orcs of the mountains, could run really fast, like bent down really low, going through the tunnels. So it's sort of, he makes it sound there like an orc is a really, really big goblin, but really. Realistically speaking, okay. Yeah, Ms. Binkley, go ahead and restart. That's fine. We'll chat for a little bit, and then whenever you're ready, you to come in. That'll be fine. So, anyway, however, the thing about it though, the main important difference between orcs and goblins is what language the name comes from. Right? That is to say, goblin is a traditional fairy tale creature, right? A goblin is a, you know, like there are stories about goblins, although it's an English word, right? And it's the name of a traditional, you know, as an English folktale and fairy tale creature. orc is a different thing, right? An orc, the word orc, that is. Orc is a made-up word in Tolkien's invented languages. It's from Elvish. So, I mean, that word is used, you know, you can find the word orc used in Anglo-Saxon, for instance, but it's not the same word. The word orc comes from Tolkien's invented languages. So you have the traditional English word goblin, and you have his new made-up word orc. And he uses the one instead of the other sometimes. And so when you get to the Lord of the Rings especially, people use the words almost interchangeably. People talk about goblins and orcs, and it seems more to have to do with who's talking than with, like, the Hobbits will often refer to them as goblins. Very few other people do. So essentially, orcs and goblins are the same thing. There are different species of orcs. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, but it isn't really exactly true to say, like, you know, orcs and goblins are totally different species of creatures. They're really not. It's just two different ways to talk about the same general kind of species of creature. But good. And Will F wants to know, is there a Lord of the Rings camp? Well, there may well be. There's not this year. This year we're just doing the Hobbit camp. This is our first Hobbit camp, but we are really excited to follow it up. We are very interested to do a Lord of the Rings, maybe a Fellowship of the Ring camp next year. One of the things we're going to be doing over the next week or so is we're going to be sending you guys a survey to let us know, like, what stuff would you like to do, and all that. Here we go, Ms. Binkley. Let me set you up there again.
Okay.
So that you can share your screen. Glad things seem to be working now. That's good.
I had to restart. It's going to take a moment to get everything open, but that's good. We're back. Yay!
No problem. Okay, excellent. So Will, I think a Lord of the Rings camp is very likely to happen, and if you would be interested in doing a Lord of the Rings camp, then I hope you will. You will let us know that, so that we can make sure to plan on that. Jubilee asks, how old was Tolkien when he published The Hobbit? 45. He was 45 years old on the year that The Hobbit was published. It was just about to turn 46. So yeah, he was pretty old when The Hobbit was published. I mean, that was really his first book, so, you know, a lot of people might feel, if they hadn't, you know, if they were a writer and they hadn't published a book before they were 46, they might feel like their career's not going all that well, right? But Tolkien was 45 when his first book came out, and when The Lord of the Rings came out, he was 62, right? He was almost at retirement age when The Lord of the Rings came out. So anyway, he'd been a professor for years then, by that time. So yeah, these stories are things he was working on from when he was young, but he never did actually publish any of it in a book form until he was middle-aged. So, all right, I will now hand you off to Ms. Binkley, as we seem to have everything sorted. Thanks for your questions. Keep your questions coming about Chapter 17 here as we move through the day as usual, and we will keep talking. I look forward to seeing you guys again at the end of the class. Bye now.
Well, hi, everybody. Sorry for the computer problems, but computers are just computers. They do what they're going to do, and we work with them as best we can. So I have only Chapter 17 to talk about today, and I hope that you have had a chance to read that chapter. This one here is called The Clouds Burst. And there are several things that happen in this. Some of them are pretty exciting. Some of them are pretty momentous, meaning that things really change because of them. And some of them are kind of sad. So let's take a look and see what's going on here. We're going to start with looking at our map of Wilderland. Remember, this is where the battle is going on. We'll be looking at some maps that show a closer up view of them later. But we do want to remember Mount Gundabad over here. And we do want to remember the Iron Hills that were over here, because those are going to be mentioned in our story. Remember, the Elven King and Bard have kind of camped out here, right outside the gate. And Thorin is under the influence of the dragon horde. And he's becoming very possessive of the entire treasure. And the only thing he's agreed to do is to give the Lake Town men back, to pay them for the help that they got. He's not taking into consideration that their entire town was destroyed by Smaug. He's not taking into consideration the friendship that dwarves have always had with the men of this region. And he's also highly irritated that the Elven King is there, because remember, even though the Elven King did not mistreat Thorin, he was not treating him extremely well either, because he locked him up in the dungeon. So anyway, this is all going on as our story is starting. So remember, Bilbo took the Arkenstone to the camps of the elves and men, and he turned it over to them. And he said, here, this may help you with your bargaining with Thorin, because Thorin values it more than a river of gold. And anyway, then Bilbo went back to the Lonely Mountain, and the dwarves never knew that he left. So the elves and men bring the Arkenstone to the Lonely Mountain, and they say, we've got this. We will give it back to you if you give us what we need, which is money to rebuild our town. And Thorin is angry. How did you get the Arkenstone? And he's making all sorts of threats and anger and gnashing and say, all right, I'll buy it back. I'm really angry. Rawr. And Gandalf is the one who's actually holding the chest that has the Arkenstone in it. You're not being a very good king. You're not sharing your treasure to the people who really deserve to have a share of this treasure. You're not giving treasure back to Dale. Their treasure's in there. You know, you're not being very kingly. And Thorin wants to know, how did you get this stone? And Bilbo confesses, I gave it to them. Well, Thorin is enraged. So he calls Bilbo all sorts of names and wants to throw him off the big wall that they built in the front gate, wants to get rid of him. And Gandalf's going like, that's my burglar, and if you don't want him anymore, you need to give him back. You can't harm him, you can't damage him, you need to give him back to me. So Bilbo then leaves and joins the elves and men and Gandalf. So Thorin says, all right, I will pay a ransom for the stone. I will give you gold and silver, but I won't give you any jewels. And that's my final offer. Well, just as they're doing this bargaining back and forth, who would show up but Dane from the Iron Hills? He's come from this way, and he has 500 dwarves with him. And these dwarves are armed and well supplied, and they have been moving fast. And Dane comes up there and he says, basically, why are you elves and men here? Because this is like dwarven territory. Basically, we're going in. And Bard said, no, you're not. And Dane's going, yes, we are. And Bard's saying, okay, you want to go in, you're going to have to basically battle us to get in there. And all of a sudden, the Elven King starts backpedaling. Now, this is a man who really wants treasure, because remember, we talked yesterday about the Elven King did not have as large a treasure as Elven Kings of old had. So therefore, he wanted to increase his treasure. But not in this way. He says, long will I tarry ere I begin this war for gold. It's not worth having a battle just for gold. So the elves and the men are there getting ready to battle. And Dane is coming in getting ready to battle. Thorin and the company are all holed up inside the Lonely Mountain. And then all of a sudden Gandalf steps in and says, halt. Like, in other words, you guys need to listen to me. And then he tells them, remember, yesterday we talked about there was some news that he said, to Bilbo, I have heard some news that even the ravens haven't heard. And he now shares the news with the elves, the men, and Dane's company of dwarves. And what he tells them is that goblins and wargs are on their way. They have also heard that the dragon is dead, and the treasure is now not protected by the dragon, so they're coming to take it. And the other thing he tells them is that Bolg, who is the son of Azog, Dane killed Azog in the Battle of Azanulbazar, and Bolg is Azog's son, and Bolg is coming, and it's like things are now going to get real messy with a really, really big battle. So let's answer some of our questions before we move on and start talking about the battle. The goblins, Will F. says, the goblins rode the wargs. Would they ride the bats? Well, actually, the bats are not super sized like the size of eagles. And in order for a goblin to be able to ride on a bat, it would have to be a really, really big bat. And so, no, they didn't ride on those. But they did ride, some goblins rode on the wargs. And we're going to be looking at that in just a moment. Amy wanted to know if Bard was a human. Yes, he is. He is a man. He is of the race of men with a capital M. That means all human beings are of the race of men when it has a capital N. A capital M, I mean. Sometimes you'll find that the term men gets used a little bit loosely, and person and people and things like that. You might think those are humans, but you have to be paying attention to what's going on in the story, because sometimes dwarves are referred to as people. They're not usually referred to as men, however, they're referred to as dwarves. So you just kind of have to pay attention to what you're reading, because sometimes you'll see a small lowercase m for men, and sometimes you'll see an uppercase m for the race of men. Amy also has another question. Where did Thorin's common sense go? Well, Thorin was becoming dragonish because he was looking on this goal that a dragon had set on for a really long time. And the enchantment of that the dragon had on the gold was rubbing off on him. And he was wanting to hoard it. So that's where his common sense went. He just decided it should be mine, all mine. So we'll see, tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about Thorin and his common sense, but that's an excellent question, Amy. Thank you for asking. So let's take a look at our next slide. And this one here has a map from the Atlas of Middle-earth, and the author of that is Fonstad. I'm going to read you some things here, and then we're going to talk about this map. And we're going to start talking about the battle. The battle is complicated, as many battles are. And sometimes the good guys, the dwarves, the men, and the elves are winning. Sometimes the bad guys, the wargs and the goblins, are winning. So the battle is going back and forth and back and forth, and we're going to be talking about that today. Make sure that if you have any questions about how the battle is unfolding, make sure you ask those, okay? Because it can get complicated. But let's look at our quotes to start with. Then they, the goblins, learned of the death of Smaug, and joy was in their hearts, and they hastened night after night through the mountains, and came thus at last on a sudden from the north, hard on the heels of Dane. So the goblins had heard about the death of Smaug, and they decided, we're going to get that treasure. But instead of traveling over land, they were going through their tunnels, and nobody knew the goblins were coming. That's why the ravens couldn't give that news to Thorin and the dwarves, because they didn't see them because they were underground. So they arrive right after Dane arrives. So it's like Dane shows up, goblins show up. So let's take a look at our next quote. On the southern spur, on its lower slopes, and in the rocks at his feet, this is the southern, this is the other, this side here we're talking about. The elves were set. On the eastern spur, this side over here, this is where the dwarves and were the men and dwarves. But Bard and some of the nimblest of men and elves climbed to the height of the eastern shoulder. So this is the eastern shoulder. So they climbed up here so they could gain a view to the north, because that's the directions that it ends up that the goblins are coming. So the goblin army had gathered, driving wildly up between the arms of the mountain. Now the plan that they laid out, remember Gandalf said, wait a minute, the goblins and wargs are coming, when he said halt. And so they laid out their plans very quickly. And the elves were going to be here. The elf king is up in here. Now here's that pool, and here's the front gate. Thorin's back in here, okay? And Dane and the lake men are here, along with the dwarves and the men. Bard and some of the elves and men who were really agile, they went up there. The plan was, between these two arms of the mountain, they were going to try to lure all the goblins and wargs in there, and then they could battle them in here. Now, Ms. Fonstad has put in a skirmish line right here. A skirmish line is like where the two groups would meet. That's the line where the battle is met. So here she shows that there are wolf riders. They were in the forefront. So she has them here in the forefront. And then goblins, wolves, and wargs on both sides coming up this way. And then the guard of Bolg was in the rear, okay? So here we have our running river going out. Dale is down this direction. We are not close to Dale. We're right between the two kind of arms of the mountain. And the goal is to trap the goblins and wargs in there and do damage there. So we have everybody all lined out there. So let's take a look now what happens. So the goblin army, hear this quote from page 253 in my book. The goblins had gathered, driving wildly up between the arms of the mountain. Arm here, arm here. Victory seemed at hand when a cry rang out on the heights above. So that would be up here, the heights above. This is the side of the mountain. Goblins had scaled the mountain from the other side. So goblins actually came from the north and climbed over the sides of the mountain. So now, instead of the goblins being trapped between here, between the elves and the dwarves and men, now the dwarves, men, and elves are trapped between goblins to the north and goblins to the south. So let's finish our quote here. Goblins had scaled the mountain from the other side, and already many were on the slopes above the gate. Victory now vanished from hope. They had only stemmed the first onslaught of the black tide. So, even though they did have them trapped, and they thought victory was near at hand, all of a sudden more goblins come in from the north, come around the mountains, and the men, elves, and dwarves are trapped. Things are not going well. Like I said, the battle looked good. Now it's swaying the other way. Let's take a look at our questions. Amy has a question that says that Elrond is seeming smarter than the wood elves. Why is that? Because remember, the wood elves were less wise than the high elves. We talked about that a few days ago. And Elrond was actually descended from the high elves. And so he would be wiser because he has, I think, just a bigger all-around experience and understanding of the world, Amy. And Amy also has a really good question about why did the dwarves listen to Thorin? Because he was the king. That's why. He's the king. You support your king. There was another question here about were there any other dwarves? This is from Jubilee. Were there any other dwarves that were with Thorin that were affected by the sickness? You know, I think that even though it's not specifically spelled out, there were only really 3 dwarves that did not agree with Thorin. And they're mentioned by name in the book. And one of them was Bombur. He's the guy who fell in the Enchanted River. And the other 2 that are mentioned by names who did not agree with Thorin were Fili and Kili, his nephews. Now, they did not act against Thorin, but they did not agree with Thorin hoarding the gold. They didn't say, oh, no, you shouldn't do it. They just said, it just said that they didn't agree with him. But the other elves were in agreement that with Thorin. Okay, Jubilee has another question. Oh, no, that was the one about the elves there. Let's go, here we go. Here's the other one from Jubilee. Jubilee wonders who is the great goblin, or who was the great goblin. At this stage in the story, it is past tense. He was the leader of the goblins that the company met up with. Bolg is coming into the story now, and we don't really get any more information other than he is the son of Azog, and that we can read from we can read information that Tolkien has written that Azog is the father of Bolg, and Dane killed Azog. And that's about it. But other than that, I don't know who the Great Goblin was, other than the leader of that particular group of goblins that captured the company. Allison has a question about why are the southern and eastern spurs shown opposite each other? I think that is actually artistic license, you might call that. It's the way that the map maker, Ms. Fonstad, had decided to draw this so that it really could fit onto one map. We're going to take a look at another map in a little bit, Allison, and if you still have questions, be sure to ask those. CJ wants to know, what are the wargs? Well, the wargs are described in the chapter about Out of the Frying Pan. In that one where they're trapped up in the trees, that they talk about wargs being wild wolves that are in the wild. And they are called wargs because they are in the wild. Remember that line we talked about on the map, that we are now over the boundary into the wild. And so wolves apparently are called wargs. And how old is Bolg? CJ would like to know that. You know, I don't think that it's ever mentioned how old he is, other than he was a leader of a group of goblins. And so he probably was old enough to be respected or had earned the respect of the people he was leading. Okay? Joshua has a really interesting question. Is there anything in Rome that looks like stuff in The Hobbit? Not in Rome particularly. Rome is a big city of about 4 million people. With the buildings aren't skyscrapers, but there are lots of tall buildings, 7 and 8 stories tall. And those certainly don't happen in The Hobbit at all. As for mountains and things like the wild, there's a big mountain range down the middle of Italy, but it's quite a ways away from Rome. So we have hills here, but there aren't a lot of mountains. And it's not like the Shire at all, even though it's not called the Shire. It's not like Bilbo's home in Hobbiton. It's not like that at all. There are some parts in central Italy that are nice and green with rolling hills, but they still don't really look like Hobbiton. So let's go ahead. That's a very interesting question, Joshua. Let's go ahead and take a look at our next slide here. Over here on this side, remember, this is the elves. We're going to talk about Bilbo for a moment. Whoops. Okay. He, meaning Bilbo, put on his ring early in the business, meaning the battle, and vanished from sight, if not from all danger. A magic ring of that sort is not a complete protection in a goblin charge, nor does it stop flying arrows and wild spears, but it does help and getting out of the way. So what Bilbo did was he decided he would be over here on the side with the Elven King. So he went to that side and put on his ring and did his best to stay out of the line of battle. Now in this map, Ms. Fonstad has a little bit more detail here, and there are a few more things that are coming in, but let's look at the top section here for just a moment. You can see that the goblins and the wolves are coming around into the area between the mountains, mountain range here. And there are elves and men down in here. There's dwarves down in here. And then you'll see the name Thorin here in the middle. So here we go. Here, once again, goblins and wolves came down here with the first assault. See, this is named assault. That means the first battle. So they were lured in here. Dane and Bard were on this side. The Elven King and the elves, along with Bilbo, are on this side. During the first assault, things were looking good for the good guys, the elves, dwarves, and men. Then, in the second assault, this being the peak of the Lonely Mountain, the goblins came here, and they flanked. That's what they call it whenever you come around the side. They flank the Elven King and the men and the dwarves. They start losing again. So the elves had charged first in here, and they were extremely bitter about elves and wargs. So let's take a look at some of these pictures of the battle. Here we have, if you look real carefully, you can see all of these wargs coming, and here in the foreground, a goblin riding a warg. And it says, ere long, the vanguard swirled around the spur's end and came rushing into Dale. These were the swiftest wolf riders, and already their cries and howls rent the air afar. So they were making a lot of racket as they come up between those two arms. That's the first assault. Now, let's take a look at this next one. The elves were the first to charge. Their hatred for the goblins is cold and bitter. Their spears and swords shone in the gloom with a gleam of chill flame. So deadly was the wrath of the hands that held them. And here we have a very dramatic picture of elves on one side, and men actually as well, fighting all these goblins and wargs, and these are not pleasant looking individuals over here. So the elves were the first ones to lead the charge. They came in because they were just so bitter against the goblins. Then the men and dwarves came in. Then over the mountain comes the goblins, and the battle turns. Let's take a look here at some questions. Jubilee has a question. It mentions that the elves' hatred for the goblins is cold and bitter. What did they mean by that? Did the goblins do something to receive the wood elves' cold and bitter hatred? Well, it has to do with the relationship between goblins and elves, and they have had wars with each other for a really long time. Remember that Orcrist and Glamdring were both created for the elf and goblin wars many, many thousands of years ago. So they have had this hatred and this battle going on between these two groups for a really long time. What they did to dislike each other so much, I can't really say because it's not really mentioned here in The Hobbit. Just that they do have a very strong dislike for each other. CJ wants to know if there's a girl in the picture here. I think this is probably just an elf with long hair, and this one here has a beard, so unless it's a woman with a beard, it would be a man. And then down here, I think this one with the really long braided beard would probably be a dwarf. But even in this one, you can see the bats. Look at those fangs, man. Those are not pleasant bats. And this club with the spikes, yeah, just really, really a nasty, nasty battle. So the battle turns. First of all, remember, the good guys are winning. The elves, men, and dwarves. Those are what I'm calling the good guys. And then the wargs and the goblins start winning. And all of a sudden, Bolg's bodyguard appears. And I'm assuming Bolg is in there as well. But then there he is at the back of this thing, and it looks like they're just going to lose and all be wiped out, and the goblins are going to get the treasure. So let's see what happens next. Suddenly, there was a great shout, and from the gate came a trumpet call. They had forgotten Thorin. Part of the wall, moved by levers, fell outward with a crash into the pool. Out leapt the king under the mountain. To me, elves and men, to me, O my kinsfolk, he cried, and his voice shook like a horn in the valley. So they'd forgotten that even though Thorin was in there with a very small group of dwarves, they all of a sudden burst out, and this actually, his running out drew elves and men and dwarves to him, because that's how powerful of a king this man actually is whenever he isn't under the influence of the dragon sickness. And so they come there, and their onslaught, their charge is so powerful that they actually drive all the way through, and they get even to Bolg and his bodyguards. That's how powerful Thorin's charge was. And you can see, here comes Thorin out. Boom, right here. And the battle turns again. The good guys, the elves, men, and dwarves, are winning. The goblins are scattering, and they're running. They are doing extremely well. But then, let's look at our next selection here. His, meaning Thorin's, numbers were too few. His flanks were unguarded. That means the people on the side of his battle, they were unguarded. Soon the attackers were attacked, and they were forced in a great ring, facing every way, hemmed all around with goblins and wolves returning to the assault. So even though Thorin and all of the men, elves, and dwarves who came to join him were a very powerful force and actually drove through, there weren't really enough of them, and they ended up being surrounded, and they're doing battle there. Things do not look very good. So where is Bilbo? Bilbo's up here on this side, and he has the ring on. And so he's invisible, but remember, that doesn't protect him from anything. I mean, an arrow flying through the air could easily, get him. Even though he is wearing his elven armor and his elven helm, he is still pretty vulnerable. So his business, he's trying to keep out of the way. So Bilbo says that even though he did not really know the Elven King, remember, he spent all that time in the chapter Barrels Out of Bond. He spent all that time learning his way around the Elven King, and he kind of grew to respect the Elven King. And even though the Elven King had the company locked up in the dungeons, Bilbo really grew to respect him. And so what Bilbo decided was that if he has to die in battle, he wants to die defending the Elven King. And so he's there, and he thinks it is all over, that there is no chance that any of them are going to survive. And then Bilbo turns and looks off in the distance. And remember, Bilbo has really good eyes. Remember back whenever they were in Mirkwood, he's the one who spotted that boat that they could use to get across the enchanted river. So Bilbo's really good eyes look up, and he says, eagles are coming. And it's another eucatastrophe. Remember, eucatastrophe is the opposite of catastrophe. A catastrophe is something really bad. But the eucatastrophe is the opposite of that. So even though this is a catastrophe right now, they're losing the battle, they're surrounded by goblins, they are outnumbered. Bilbo looks up and sees the eagles coming, and it turns the battle again. So they were winning, they were losing, they were winning, they were losing. Now they're winning again. Is this going to be where the battle ends, or is it going to go on? Well, what happens next is, oh, here's some really cool pictures I want to talk about. With cries of Morian, Dane, Dane, the dwarves from the Iron Hills plunged in, wielding their matlocks, and on the other side beside them came the men of the lake with long swords. We have two really dramatic pictures by two different artists, and these are both really chaotic, meaning that there's just a lot of stuff going on in both of these pictures. And I selected these two because they really kind of represent what was going on in the battle. Whenever you're doing this kind of combat, it's almost hand to hand. And so that means you're swinging swords and shooting arrows and plunging spears, and you're in the face of your enemy. It's not like as if you're way back, you know, on the other side of the mountain, telling people what to do. You are actually in there facing the enemy, facing them right down. And so I picked these two pictures because it really does show that. And here you have the green banner of the elves, and here you have elves with their swords and in their armor. And here you can see wargs and goblins, and they are literally head to head in battle. Now, this is one of the things that I always did in all the classes that I taught, was I would always pick out the tallest student in the class. I'm not very tall, so I'd always pick out the tallest student in the class and demonstrate face-to-face combat with that person. Everybody always laughs because here's little round Miss Binkley, and usually a person who's maybe even 6 feet tall, either a boy or a girl. And I'm showing them, you know, of course, we're not bumping into each other or anything, like the kind of moves that people would do in battle. It's always good for pretty good for a laugh to see Miss Binkley do that. And over here on this one, an entirely different look, but still, look here, you can still see them. They are right there together, battling almost hand to hand. They're in each other's faces. And this one here shows all the chaos, and I like how this one is represented because you see the storm of arrows coming out, and look at this forest of spears. It's just like, wow. You know, there's a lot going on in here. Excuse me. And this guy here looks like he's picking up a rock to throw it at someone. That's the kind of thing that would happen in a face-to-face battle. If your sword gets knocked out of your hand and the closest thing is pick up as a big boulder and throw it at somebody, at your enemy, you're going to do that. You know, because you're trying to keep yourself going. And if you don't have a weapon, you're going to take whatever is at hand. Let's take a quick look at our questions. Oh, here's a question from Russell. Thank you, Russell, for this question. Was Legolas in The Lord of the Rings related to the High Elves or the Wood Elves? He was actually a Wood Elf. And we would find out in the, I think it's in book 2 of the Fellowship of the Ring, we find out that Legolas is related to the Elven King. But we don't know that in The Hobbit. But when we find it, if you've read The Hobbit and then you read The Fellowship of the Ring, it's really kind of exciting because it's almost like you know him already because you know who the Elven King is. So that is a very good question. Thank you for asking that, Russell. Jubilee wants to know, who was the bodyguard of Bolg? It's not really mentioned that who they are or described. They're just referred to as the bodyguard. And usually if you have bodyguards, those are pretty powerful and well-trained individuals to protect the person. So I would imagine that, in my imagination, in my mind movie, that whoever is around Bolg would be the more elite warriors. and they would be there to protect him because he probably is their ruler. CJ has a very good question. How comes Bjorn is on the map? You need to come back tomorrow because we will be talking about Bjorn tomorrow. And what is the yellow stuff in Mr. Lee's picture? The yellow stuff up here at the top, if this is what you're referring to, this is probably just smoke, or it could even be a lot of bats, because there were so many bats and birds that they actually darkened the sky. If you're referring to this down here, this is the banner of the woodland folk of the Elven King, and it was a green banner, and that's mentioned in the book that the banner of the Lakemen was blue and the banner of the Wood Elves was green. So let's take a look at our next slide. We're going to go back to this particular slide here. Nope, this is not the slide I want. This is not the slide you're looking for. There we go. So, catastrophe time. The eagles, he shouted. The eagles are coming. Bilbo's eyes were seldom wrong. The eagles, cried Bilbo once more, but at that moment, a stone, hurling from above, smote heavily on his helm, and he fell with a crash and knew no more. So that's it for Bilbo. But we have some really cool pictures here. This one is from the Rankin Bass Hobbit movie, and I think it's about, I don't know, 50 years old, and it is an adorable movie. It's a lot of fun to watch. It doesn't match the book because movies usually can't match a book. So it's a little bit different, but I just really like these eagles. Look at those claws out. These eagles mean business. They are coming, and what the eagles do is they start attacking the goblins and the wargs, okay? And this one here by Mr. Naismith, this one here, look at this eagle. He looks like he means total business. This one here, since there's a goblin in the picture, some goblins down here, you can kind of get an idea of how large these eagles are. Like, remember, they're big enough to carry a full-grown man, the size of Gandalf, and didn't have any problem carrying the dwarves or Bilbo. So coming here, what they do is they start attacking the goblins. And I like this one here because here's a goblin actually taking aim with an arrow at the eagles. I thought that was a really interesting turn of the Mine movie because my personal Mine movie never had anybody shooting at the eagles. My personal Mine movie was these eagles here. These are mean eagles. Nobody's shooting at them. Whereas this one here actually made me think when I saw this image and I said, wow, it makes sense. If you've got a bow with arrows, you're probably going to shoot at the eagle if it's coming at you. It never occurred to me. Isn't that interesting, the way things happen? That's why I like to look at all these different pictures and share them with you, because even if your Mind movie has made something, it's really exciting to see other people's ideas, because it kind of like all of a sudden opens up like almost a little window and you say, oh, I never thought of that. That's really interesting. Okay, I'm not seeing any new questions here, so let's go ahead and move on to our last slides. Your journal drawings and questions. I hope that everybody has been having a good time keeping up with their journal and the questions. Remember, this is your journey through Middle-earth. It's not Miss Binkley's journey through Middle-earth. It's your journey through, and it's almost like your diary of the things that you've learned and the things that you've seen in your Mind movie as you've been reading the book. So I hope you've been enjoying creating your trip through Middle-earth. Now, this one here is sketch one of Dane's dwarves dressed for battle. It can be Dane, it can be one of his dwarves. There are some really good descriptions of what the dwarves looked like. And I'm hoping that you get a chance to go back and read that section over again, and then create one of Dane's dwarves from the Iron Hills. Answer, who stopped the battle for the Arkenstone? Our next one is sketch the eagles or Beorn coming to battle. If you are going to sketch Beorn, you might want to wait until tomorrow, and because we are going to be talking about Beorn. And then this next one, name the 5 armies, because this is called the Battle of 5 Armies. It can get controversial. A lot of people have opinions about who were the 5 armies. So make sure you read that section and then you decide and list your 5 armies. Amy has a really interesting question for us. Are dwarves the same thing as humans, just small? Actually, they're a different group of people. They're not related to humans. The same way that dwarves are a different kind of people, elves are a different kind of people, they're not related to dwarves, and men are a different kind of people. And they're just like 3 different groups of, and types of people, and they all had like different ways of living and different ways of thinking, and like different things. So no, they are not humans, just small. And Amy also has another question about if there were orcish pikemen, and were there orcish pikemen, and if so, could they spear the eagles? That goes back to Mr. Naismith's drawing of the one orc shooting his crossbow at the eagle. It never occurred to me that they were fighting eagles back when I read this. So you're right there with Mr. Naismith, because Mr. Naismith in his mind movie, he had the orcs fighting, or the goblins fighting back against the eagles. So yes, I'm sure there were pikemen, because that would have been the type of weapons that some goblins would be using. And whether or not they could spear the eagles, if the eagles came close enough, I'm sure that they would have tried. Whether or not they would have been successful, I don't know. Let's take a look at our first question. So, who stopped the battle for the Arkenstone? Remember, the battle for the Arkenstone was just getting started, and Gandalf steps in and says, "Halt." He appeared suddenly and stood alone with his arms uplifted between the advancing dwarves and the ranks awaiting them. The ranks awaiting them were the elves and men. "Halt," he called in a voice like thunder, and his staff blazed forth with a flash like lightning. So in other words, he got their attention, no question about that. And he steps in and says, "No." And then he tells him that the goblins and the wargs are coming. But Gandalf is indeed the one who stopped the battle. And then the 5 armies that I listed from the book, and they're listed on page 251 of my edition, are goblins and wild wolves. They are on one side. And then elves, men, and dwarves are on the other side. And so those are the 5 that I found listed. You may have other opinions, and that is okay, because you are reading the book critically and asking really good questions. So I trust you that if you determine that there are either more armies or you don't agree with this list, that's fine with me, because you're critical thinking and critically reading the book. Let's see if we have any more questions before I conclude here. Well, it is 8 o'clock. Boy, this class went by really fast. Tomorrow we're going to do the last 2 chapters, chapters 18 and 19. We are going to talk a little bit more about the Battle of 5 Armies. And then we're going to talk about the end of the story. So with that, Professor Olson, I have concluded today's talk.
Excellent. Very good. Excellent. Very good. So thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Tomorrow will be our final session, and we look forward to coming to the end of the book and seeing what happens when Bilbo gets back to Bag End and how things look different at that time. And, of course, revisiting his entire trip on the way back home, right, and to see what happens then. So thanks very much, everybody, for joining us, and we will see you guys tomorrow afternoon. Bye.
Bye-bye.